So the first part of this piece we did the sky, and it's a very watered down mix of mostly rose with a touch of the orange and a touch of the French ultramarine, just to dull it down a little bit. But on a value scale, we're working at about a 1 right now. And I just pull it down to the horizon and kind of mop up the bottom. Next, I'm mixing up the blues. I've got a little turquoise, but mostly the French ultramarine, and I pulled it into some of my mud that's already on the tray just to dull it down a little bit. And for the dry brush, take my napkin and just press the bottom of the brush where the ferrule is along there on the napkin to soak up the extra water, and that will give you your dry brush. There needs to be just enough water in there for the paint to go across the page, and on the side of the brush, not with the tip, you just scrape it across the paper, and the little ridges in the paper, or the lumps, those will create that sparkle in the water. So I keep that sunbeam path going through and slowly build it up. So I go from the outside in so that it's filled in a bit more on the outside area, kind of pushing your attention into that white. Now I got to mix up some sand. So I'm getting the French ultramarine and the orange. Orange and blue makes brown. And I just keep adding more orange until it turns the color of brown I want it to be. Since we're going to start in the back area, we need to mix up some really light colored sand. So I will add some yellow into this mix to lighten it up even more. So again, I'm going to do the dry brush up at the shoreline there, kind of capture that foam that's coming up on the shore. So get rid of all that moisture. And so I just kind of gently rub that sand onto there. So now as I get closer, I start adding in some water. And get rid of all the sparkles down here where the sand is. And then I'll get my colors to get a little darker and more intense as I get closer to help give a sense of distance. So now I've got plenty of water in my brush, and I keep it nice and juicy so my wash stays wet. So here's the brown mix. It's got a little more orange into it. And blue, darken it a little bit more. Every time I go back and remix a little more, the color changes a little bit, so I've got plenty of good variation. And then I'm just going to work on building up those darks in the foreground a bit. So with less water in my brush, I make a darker mix. Maybe add a little rose. I'm just slashing some darks into here. Now my paper is slightly drying because I'm working slowly, so I'll lift out some of the blossoms and then I'll let some of them just happen for fun. Make it a little more interesting. So I'm just adding in some more lumps and shadows, and everything's really wet right now, so it's giving me some interesting shapes and blossoms as things separate when they dry. So now I'm going to put in that background building to start with, and we'll mix up with some French ultramarine and rose, get some purple going, and then I'll bring that purple over into my orange and brown mix over here to turn it into kind of a purple gray color. And it's looking a little too orangey, so add some more blue, gray it down more. And then to keep a sense of looseness, I'm going to paint with my brush from the end of the handle and kind of wiggle in those shapes, the columns. So I bring that all the way down to where the rocks are, and then carve out the tops of the rocks where the highlights are hitting them. And then I'll pull out this little pier. So I'm just dropping in some more bluer grays. Give a bit of variation back here and create an illusion of detail by mixing up different colors there. And then I'll even add in just a couple little touches of some Payne's Gray for some shadowing. And everything's wet, so all the colors are just dropping into one another and blending around. No hard edges in there. So we'll add some of those distant rocks. Put a little shadow on that pier thing. So I'm making a gray with that French ultramarine and orange. So I'll have kind of a dark, warm gray. And here I'm putting in my rocks and skipping around for the highlight areas. And then I'll come back with an even darker mix at the end and give them some shadows on the bottom. Remember, it is sunny side up today. Keep those rocks sunny. So now I'm going to try to put in that furthest boat, the blue part, dulling down that French ultramarine a little bit with a little bit of my mud from the tray. And I'll try to just swipe across with one stroke. And there you go. That's the boat, and I will add a red stripe on the top there by mixing the rose with the orange and a little bit of the mud just to darken it even more. And with one motion right across. Now for these other boats, I'm going to do the shading on them first, because the top part of the boat is in the highlight in the sun, and the side of the boat is in the shadow. So I made a muddy purple. It's got rose, blue, orange. If it looks too purple, I'll just add a dash of yellow to it. And in the foreground one, we'll have some of that shading with that purple, and we'll have some areas where it's a little more blue for the cooler parts, and some areas where it's a little more orange for the warmer parts. Because in the shadows, there's still warm and cool areas. So here, filling my boat, leaving that highlight space on top for where the sun's coming in. And then get darker around the edges to give it a sense of form. So these areas, these are the cooler shadows, the darker ones. And the lighter parts are the more orangey, warmer shadows. So this middle boat, have the colors be a bit more intense because it's getting closer. And then soften that bottom edge a little bit. And then add that rose and orange mix for the red stripe. And then we'll put that dark shadow on the bottom, and that's the orange and French ultramarine mixed together. So now I'm going to add on that turquoise at the bottom of this boat, and I'm mixing in some orange to dull down the turquoise. Darkening it with a little bit of the French ultramarine mix. And soften the edge on the top. So now we're going to do the red on the top of this boat. And I'll get some orange and rose mix again and get rid of the water from the base of the brush so I can sort of scrape these on with a dry brush. So I want it to be a little bit broken up and not a big heavy line, and that will help give the look of the sun really coming down on it. So just keep scraping on my shape and sort of skip around a bit. And I even drop in a little bit of shadow on the underside there. And I realized I kind of lost the shape of my boat a little bit, so I'm just adding it back onto there. So now we can add those really dark shadows at the bottom of the boat, and I'm mixing some more of the orange and blue, and I'll have very little water in my brush so it stays very dark. And I'll kind of let it get dry and light as the shadows fade out. And I'll still have some of that dark and just add a couple of little shadows and footprints. Just make sure the ones that are towards the shore are very light and don't put in too many. Just here and there a few. So now I'm just getting some of my Payne's gray, and I'm going to use my liner brush to kind of scribble in some wiggly writing over here on the side of the boat. And then I'll fling up a couple of masts. And I'm using the end of my brush to paint with so that things stay a little wobbly and loose. And I'll sweep in these ropes with some quick motions so that I have a little bit more of a smooth line. and just let it fade out at the end. So I realized that didn't have quite enough shadow on the front of this foreground boat. So I am going back over this carefully with a light glaze, adding some more dark shadows around the edges and some warm shadows in the areas where it bows out so it has even more form to it. These shadows, you need these shadows to bring it to life, otherwise it just looks flat. And if you want to glaze over something, just make sure that you're completely dry before you go over it again. So now we'll put in our little people. And I always start with the torsos. And this guy's just kind of a muddy blue shirt on. And then with just some straight orange, I'll give him a little pinhead on top. Be careful to keep those heads small and like little pinhead guys, because otherwise they'll turn into giant lollipop heads very quickly. And we need these guys to give us a sense of scale. So if you have two giant people out in the middle there, it'll look pretty crazy. This other guy gets the striped shirt, so just put a couple of slashes across there to represent his shirt. And then some wobbly legs. And another little orange head. And the last thing you put in, just those little tiny V-shaped birds up in the sky. Scatter them around a little bit. Have a few that are lighter so they look farther away. And there you have it.